for maritime safety and marine environmental protection. I commend this bill to the House.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Iain-Lees, Galloway.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak in support of the marine legislation bill, a largely technical omnibus bill that is probably worthy of the level of passion we saw from the Minister in her contribution. It was a very accurate representation of the legislation and of the Select Committee process. Perhaps not an entirely accurate representation of some of the issues behind the bill, of course, and I will get to those later on in my contribution. I would like to thank the officials for their diligent work in assisting the Select Committee in what was a very technical piece of legislation that required a lot of technical advice. And I'd also like to thank my new colleagues on the transport. No, I wasn't there, but I'm still going to thank them. That's the kind of guy I am. I did make some brief visits to the Transport Industrial Relations Committee, and now I have the pleasure of being a permanent member of that committee. So I'd like to thank my new colleagues on that committee for the good work that they put into this piece of legislation as well. Mr Speaker, this marine legislation bill is an omnibus bill of two parts. Part 1 seeks to amend the Maritime Transport Act 1994, and Part 2 seeks to amend the Exclusive Economic Zone and Continental Shelf Environmental Effects Act 2012, which of course was passed through this Parliament merely weeks before this piece of legislation was introduced to make amendments to that piece of legislation. And I don't know whether that's a reflection of the shambolic approach that this government takes to making laws, that they needed to fix up something that they'd only just passed merely weeks later. But them's the facts, and we worked hard to try and tidy up some of the government's shoddy work. Mr Speaker, this bill amends the Maritime Transport Act to provide for local regulation of maritime safety and maritime-related activities by regional councils, to regulate alcohol consumption by seafarers, to implement 4 international maritime conventions, to create offences and prescribe penalties for the improper operation of ships, and to make other miscellaneous changes. It amends the Exclusive Economic Zone and Continental Shelf Environmental Effects Act to make new provisions in relation to discharges and dumping, and to ensure that New Zealand continues to act consistently with 2 international conventions to which we are party. Mr Speaker, the bill implements a number of international conventions. The Convention on the Limitation of Liability for Maritime Claims is currently only partially applied in New Zealand, meaning maritime liability is half what it could be for loss of life, injury, property damage or other damage or loss. This bill enacts the Convention fully and gives it the full force of law. The International Convention on Civil Liability for Bunker Oil Damage 2001 is fully implemented in this bill as well. It sets up a separate liability regime for fuel oil pollution, meaning claims would not be limited by the Convention on the limitation of liability for maritime claims. The International Convention relating to intervention on the high seas in cases of oil pollution casualties 1969 has a protocol that includes substances beyond those New Zealand law currently applies to, so the bill extends coverages to the substances in the protocol. Mr Speaker, the bill also introduces a 0.05 micrograms per 100 millilitres of blood alcohol limit on all seafarers. And this is perhaps one of the more curious aspects of this piece of legislation. Because while the government has accepted an international convention that 0.05 is an appropriate and acceptable alcohol limit for seafarers, the government has continued to abjectly refuse the concept that that is an appropriate level for car drivers. It seems odd that when only 80 vessels will be affected by this change, and it is estimated that there are just 10 incidents a year that will be affected by this new regulation, that the government is so quick to move on this change to alcohol, to blood alcohol levels, when it is not prepared to act on the 34% of fatal car accidents that have been linked to alcohol. Mr Speaker, it is utterly inconsistent from this government to acknowledge that 0.05 is an appropriate blood alcohol level for operating a vessel, and yet refuse to act on something which has got the potential to save far more lives and do far more good than simply implementing this for seafarers alone. But that, Mr. Speaker, is not the most curious aspect of this legislation. The most curious part is that it took so long for the government to actually implement the conventions that this legislation allows us to sign up to. And in particular, the one that most New Zealanders will be mindful of is the civil liability for bunker oil damage, or the Bunker Convention as is more commonly known. There was a discussion document all the way back in 2007. Local government, regional councils received a discussion document from the then Labour government about implementing that convention. But after this government came to power, everything went silent. In the briefing to the incoming minister in 2008, there was a recommendation that he implement and sign up to the International Convention on Civil Liability for Bunker Oil Pollution Damage, and to a number of changes to the Convention on Limitation of Liability for Maritime Claims. Legislation was prepared and ready to go by 2009, but that bill sat on the minister's desk. In fact, it was lucky if it was sitting on the minister's desk. It disappeared to some distant filing cabinet, never to be thought of again. So while Stephen Joyce was planning his uneconomic, unaffordable roads of national significance, a little bill waited. While Stephen Joyce was running focus groups and running scared from doing the right thing by lowering the legal blood alcohol level for drivers, a little bill waited. They've woken up. And while Stephen Joyce was busy fixing up the mistakes of his colleagues in this shambles of a government, a little bill waited and hoped that one day somebody somewhere in the government would actually pay attention to it and introduce it to the House. Well, that day, Mr. Speaker, finally came. The day when somebody in the government actually thought, gosh, we really ought to progress this maritime legislation bill, came on Wednesday, the 5th of October 2011, to be precise, at around about 2:20 a.m. That's when the Rena ran aground on the Astrolabe Reef. The ship was carrying 1,368 containers, 8 of which contained hazardous materials, as well as 1,700 tonnes of heavy fuel and 200 tonnes of marine diesel oil. All of a sudden, the marine legislation bill became very important. But it was all too late, Mr. Speaker. How late? About $50 million late. We needed this bill passed before the Rena ran aground, not afterwards. If National had managed to carry out that simple task, the New Zealand taxpayer would not be left in a position of having to fork out the lion's share of $50 million to pay for the clean-up of the Rena grounding. Mr. Speaker, when the New Zealand Shipping Federation came to the Select Committee, it approached the bill thus. The Federation said it expressed its concern regarding the haste with which the bill was being progressed. They understood the reason, that the government was attempting to quickly close the door after the horse had bolted. But they said this merely serves to compound our frustration, as it demonstrates that the maritime sector is regarded as a low priority sector within official circles. Mr. Speaker, the haste with the bill was being progressed as far as the New Zealand Shipping Federation was concerned is quite understandable, because there was in fact a time limit. That was the 1st of January 2013, because in order to meet our convention requirements regarding alcohol limits, we were supposed to have had this legislation passed by 2013. Now, I don't know if it's by January the 1st, 2013. I don't know if it's a continuation of the shambles of this government, or whether it's the walking shambles that is David Bennett. But somehow or another, the government has failed again to meet its international obligations by failing to get this legislation passed in time. Mercifully, I don't think we will suffer any penalty as a result, but Mr. Speaker, this bill is a good bill. It's a technical bill, but one that is very important to protecting our coastline and our environment. It's just a pity the government couldn't get off its chuff and do this sooner.
David Bennett.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And this is a good bill which all parties in this House, apart from probably the Green Party, are going to support. And it's very disappointing to see that last member try and politicise